Today on Rapid Report, a political shockwave is shaking Washington. In a stunning and highly unexpected move, several Republican lawmakers have broken ranks and voted to overturn former President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada. What was expected to be a unified front has turned into a dramatic fracture within the party, and the consequences could ripple far beyond Capitol Hill. Was this an act of rebellion? Or was it something far more strategic, an act of economic survival? At the center of this unfolding political drama is a deeper story: the fragile architecture of North American trade, the hidden economic pressure points linking the United States and Canada, and the high-stakes dilemma now facing Trump himself. With industries on edge, gas prices at risk, auto supply chains under strain, and 34 U.S. states exposed to retaliation, this vote may signal more than partisan disagreement. It may reveal the limits of economic nationalism in an interconnected continent. Tonight, we break down why Republicans felt forced to act, how strategic pressure reshaped congressional votes, what this means for American jobs and inflation, and why Trump now faces one of the most defining decisions of his political career. This is not just about tariffs. This is about power, leverage, and the future of North American stability. Stay with us. A major political rupture has unfolded in Washington, one that could redefine the future of North American trade and test the internal cohesion of the Republican Party. In a dramatic and unexpected move, several Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives voted alongside Democrats to overturn former President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada. According to the narrator of the video in question, this was not an act of ideological defiance, nor a moral stand against protectionism. It was, instead, an act of economic self-preservation. The vote has been described as a political earthquake. For a party long defined by loyalty to Trump's leadership, especially on trade policy, the break was startling. Trump had framed tariffs as a tool of strength, proof that the United States would no longer tolerate what he called unfair trade practices. Yet, when confronted with the concrete economic consequences of those tariffs, members of his own party recalculated. At the center of this recalibration, the narrator argues, was Mark Carney, former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. Carney is portrayed not as a partisan political actor, but as a strategic economic tactician. According to the analysis, he applied targeted pressure that exposed just how deeply American industries depend on Canadian trade. Rather than engage in rhetorical escalation, Canada allegedly focused on economic leverage points, pressure nodes capable of forcing political change inside the United States. Pressure point number 1, the auto supply chain. Shock. The first and most immediate vulnerability lies in the auto industry. North America's automobile production system is not neatly divided by borders. It is integrated. Auto parts frequently cross the U.S.-Canada border multiple times during the manufacturing process. A transmission might begin assembly in Ontario, be fitted into an engine block in Michigan, then return north for finishing before final installation in a U.S.-assembled vehicle. A 25% tariff on Canadian components would not simply be a tax on imports, it would ripple throughout the entire production chain. Economists warned that such tariffs could add thousands of dollars to the cost of a new vehicle. In industrial states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, even minor cost increases can trigger layoffs, production slowdowns, and factory closures. Republican representatives from these regions faced immediate pressure from auto manufacturers, parts suppliers, and labor groups. The math was unforgiving. Higher input costs would either slash corporate margins or be passed directly to consumers. Either outcome threatened jobs. Faced with the prospect of plant shutdowns and angry constituents, ideological alignment became secondary to economic survival. Pressure point number 2, energy dependence and heavy crude. The second leverage point was energy. While the United States is a major oil producer, not all crude oil is interchangeable. Many U.S. refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are optimized for processing heavy crude oil imported from Canada. Canada supplies a substantial portion of that heavy crude. When Canadian officials hinted at reviewing energy exports as part of a broader trade response, alarm bells rang in Washington. Analysts warned that any disruption in heavy crude flows could tighten supply and raise gasoline prices by 50 to 80 cents per gallon. For lawmakers, this was politically combustible. Fuel prices are highly visible and emotionally charged. A sudden spike at the pump often translates into immediate public anger. Republican members understood that even if the tariffs were intended as a show of economic strength, rising gas prices would be interpreted by voters as policy failure. Pressure point number 3, the retaliation map. The third and perhaps most politically potent vulnerability involved targeted retaliation. Canada is the top export market for 34 U.S. states. Agricultural products, machinery, manufactured goods, and energy equipment flow north in enormous volumes. According to the narrator, Carney and Canadian officials allegedly mapped out which congressional districts, particularly Republican-held districts, were most dependent on Canadian markets. By threatening to impose retaliatory tariffs, specifically on goods originating from those districts, Canada could localize economic pain. This was not abstract theory. Farmers, manufacturers, and exporters began contacting their representatives, warning that retaliation would devastate local economies. The possibility of being blamed for lost export contracts or shuttered family farms forced lawmakers to reconsider their position. In short, the tariffs transformed from a symbolic assertion of sovereignty into a tangible economic threat to constituents. Republicans break ranks. The House vote therefore reflected less a rebellion against Trump's authority and more a defensive maneuver. Representatives were not repudiating protectionism in principle. They were responding to immediate and measurable risks. For Trump, who expected party unity, the vote was a shock. It demonstrated that economic realities can fracture political loyalty when electoral survival is at stake. The trap for Trump. The narrator frames the situation as a strategic trap for Trump, presenting him with two difficult options. Option A, sign the resolution. By signing, Trump would effectively end the tariffs. This would stabilize markets and reassure industries, but it could also make him appear weak, having retreated under pressure. Option B, veto the resolution. A veto would preserve the tariffs and reinforce his image as uncompromising. However, it would also concentrate responsibility squarely on him. If consumer prices rose, if layoffs occurred, if inflation worsened, he would own the fallout. Either path carries political cost. The tariffs, initially framed as leverage against Canada, have become leverage against him. Impact on everyday Americans. Beyond political maneuvering, the practical consequences are significant. Tariffs function as taxes on imported goods. In an integrated economy like North America's, they cascade through supply chains. Consumers could face higher prices on cars and auto repairs, increased costs for hardware, building materials, and household goods, rising heating expenses in regions dependent on cross-border energy flows. Instead of reducing inflation, tariffs could exacerbate it. At a time when many households are already strained by rising costs, even modest increases can shift public sentiment rapidly. Global realignment. A mini Nixon shock? The narrator goes further, suggesting that prolonged trade conflict could accelerate Canada's diversification away from the United States. Canada has already expanded trade ties with Europe and Asia in recent years. If tariffs persist, Canada may deepen integration with European and Indo-Pacific markets, reducing long-term dependence on U.S. demand. The narrator likens this to a mini Nixon shock, a reference to the moment in 1971 when President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold, fundamentally reshaping global economic relationships. While the scale is different, the principle is similar. Sudden policy moves can permanently alter trade alignments. A system under strain. The House vote can be interpreted as a distress signal. North American economic integration built over decades is not easily undone without consequence. Supply chains, energy infrastructure, and export markets are interwoven in ways that defy simple nationalist rhetoric. The Republican break underscores a deeper truth. Economic interdependence limits political maneuverability. When policies threaten jobs, prices, and regional stability, even loyal allies may diverge. Trump now faces a defining decision. Whether he signs or vetoes the resolution, the outcome will reverberate across industries, households, and international relationships. The episode reveals not only the fragility of political alliances, but also the structural realities of modern trade. In the end, this was not merely a vote about tariffs. It was a confrontation between ideology and economic gravity. And gravity, at least for now, appears to have prevailed. The limits of economic nationalism in an integrated continent. For decades, the North American economy has functioned as a semi-integrated production system. Supply chains were built on the assumption of predictable cross-border flow, especially after NAFTA and its successor framework. Factories, refineries, farms, railways, and ports were optimized around frictionless trade. Tariffs in this context do not behave like traditional protectionist tools. They function more like self-inflicted transaction costs within a shared industrial organism. The deeper issue exposed by this vote is this: economic nationalism collides with structural interdependence. In theory, tariffs can force concessions from a rival economy. In practice, when the rival economy is also your primary supplier, customer, and co-producer, retaliation becomes mutual destabilization. The House vote suggests that enough Republican lawmakers recognize this structural reality. Ideology met operational supply chain math, and the math won. Market psychology and investor signaling. Another layer rarely discussed is financial market psychology. Trade wars inject uncertainty into markets. Investors respond not only to policy substance but to volatility risk. If tariffs escalate unpredictably, businesses delay capital expenditures. Hiring slows. Investment pipelines stall. The Republican vote sends a stabilizing signal to equity markets, bond markets, manufacturing investors, energy traders. It communicates that Congress may act as a moderating institution when executive trade policy threatens systemic economic disruption. In other words, this vote is not only about Canada. It is about whether institutional checks still function when markets become nervous. If investors interpret this as a sign that Congress will intervene against destabilizing tariff policy, it could reduce long-term risk premiums. If, however, Trump vetoes and doubles down, markets may price in higher volatility. Inflation politics and electoral risk. From a political economy perspective, inflation remains one of the most toxic issues in modern democracies. Tariffs are often politically attractive because they appear strong and protective, but their economic impact often surfaces as higher consumer prices, and inflation is highly visible. Gasoline prices are displayed on street corners. Grocery prices are seen weekly. Car prices are life-changing purchases. If energy costs rise by 50 to 80 cents per gallon, that is not abstract macroeconomics. That is daily frustration. Republican lawmakers in swing districts are acutely aware of this. The vote suggests they are prioritizing short-term electoral survival over long-term ideological cohesion. This creates a subtle but important shift. Economic populism loses credibility when it generates inflation rather than relief. Strategic leverage, Carney's calculated pressure. If the narrator's depiction of Mark Carney's strategy is accurate, then this episode reflects sophisticated economic statecraft. Rather than retaliating broadly and emotionally, Canada allegedly mapped vulnerabilities precisely. Which districts depend on Canadian exports? Which refineries depend on heavy crude? Which auto plants would halt first? This kind of targeted pressure is more effective than blanket retaliation. It personalizes consequences for lawmakers. This strategy mirrors modern economic deterrence logic. apply calibrated pressure that alters political incentives inside the opposing system. The remarkable element here is that the pressure did not collapse markets. It reshaped congressional voting behavior. That is strategic influence without escalation. The executive versus legislative power struggle. There's also a constitutional dimension. Trade authority in the United States is shared, but often executive-driven. Presidents frequently invoke national security justifications to impose tariffs with limited congressional oversight. This House vote signals a reassertion of legislative influence over trade policy. If Congress increasingly challenges executive tariffs, it could rebalance trade authority. That would have long-term implications for how future presidents wield economic power. In essence, this may mark the beginning of a structural tug-of-war over who controls America's trade posture. North American integration at a crossroads. The narrator describes cracks in North American integration. That assessment deserves deeper exploration. For decades, integration delivered lower production costs, competitive manufacturing clusters, energy security, agricultural stability. But integration also created political backlash. Communities that felt displaced by globalization often supported protectionist policies. This vote suggests that even politicians who benefited from protectionist rhetoric now recognize that dismantling integration carries immediate domestic costs. The system is under strain because political narratives and economic structures are misaligned. If tariffs persist, businesses may begin reconfiguring supply chains permanently, either deeper into U.S. domestic production, which takes years and massive capital, or outward toward alternative global partners. That reconfiguration would not be easily reversible. Canada's strategic diversification. If Canada accelerates trade ties with Europe and Asia, the consequences could be long-term. Diversification reduces dependence. Reduced dependence weakens leverage. Weakened leverage shifts bargaining power. If U.S. policymakers repeatedly use tariffs as a coercive tool, Canada may institutionalize alternative trade channels. Over time, that reduces U.S. centrality in North American trade flows. The analogy to a mini Nixon shock is less about scale and more about permanence. Sudden policy shocks can permanently alter trust and alignment. Trust, once disrupted in trade relationships, is costly to rebuild. Political identity versus economic reality. The most profound tension in this episode is philosophical. Trump's tariff strategy reflects a belief in economic sovereignty through pressure. The House vote reflects recognition of economic interdependence through pragmatism. This tension defines much of modern politics. Voters demand protection. Economies require integration. Leaders promise strength. Markets demand stability. When those forces collide, internal fractures appear. The broader geopolitical signal globally, allies are watching. If the United States appears willing to weaponize trade against even its closest partners, other countries may hedge against American unpredictability. That could encourage alternative trade blocs, strengthen regional agreements excluding the U.S., reduce long-term U.S. economic influence. This is not immediate collapse. It is gradual recalibration. Trump now stands at a crossroads. If he signs, he preserves economic stability but risks projecting retreat. If he vetoes, he reinforces strength rhetoric but risks economic backlash. The deeper question is not about optics. It is whether the political brand of aggressive tariff leverage can survive in an economy structurally dependent on cross-border integration. This episode may be remembered not simply as a House vote, but as a moment when economic gravity constrained political will. And once gravity becomes visible, it is very difficult to pretend it does not exist. What we are witnessing is more than a policy dispute. It is a stress test of America's political and economic foundations. The House vote signals that markets, supply chains, and voter pressure can override even the strongest party loyalty. It shows that economic gravity still shapes political outcomes, no matter how powerful the personalities involved. Now the spotlight turns back to Donald Trump. Will he sign and stabilize markets? or veto and escalate the confrontation? The answer could affect fuel prices, car costs, inflation trends, and the future of U.S.-Canada relations. And as Canada explores deeper trade partnerships abroad, the long-term alignment of North America itself may be at stake. We will continue to follow every development, every vote, and every economic ripple from this turning point. If you found this analysis clear, balanced, and insightful, make sure to support independent reporting. Subscribe to Rapid Report so you never miss critical updates. Like this video to help more viewers discover in-depth analysis. Share it with friends, colleagues, and anyone who wants to understand what's really happening behind the headlines. Your engagement helps us continue delivering serious journalism in a noisy world. Thank you for watching Rapid Report. Stay informed, stay sharp. We'll see you in the next report.